Hello, everyone. This video is going to be me going through the explanations for obedience. Quite a big bullet point, actually. If you're looking for an outline of Milgram's study, that is in a different video because it's too much to film in one video, essentially. So what we're going to be looking at more is the explanations and the situational variables surrounding why we obey, essentially, right? And something I tend to say to students to get them to start off, just a scenario essentially, to imagine that they are sitting on a train that's loads of empty seats, and a police officer walks in full gear, CS spray, handcuffs, like got British Transport Police written across them, for example, and asks you in a nice way to move down the train, but without giving you a reason. So what I tend to ask students is who genuinely believes that they would challenge the authority and disobey, who believes they would move without question, and who believes they would move but they would probably ask questions. Now, I ask students this quite a lot, and there's clearly a lot of demand characteristics, because almost nobody says they would disobey the authority figure, despite the fact I think that's not true. I do think there are a lot of disobedient students in here that would stand up, but their point is essentially mostly correct. Most people will obey the authority figure. They will obey, despite the fact they've never met this person. Especially when I change the question and say, what happens if it was a plain clothes police officer, no uniform, and they ask you to move down? The obedience rate goes down. So these slides are going to be looking at why that happens. But in order to do that, we need to understand what obedience actually is first, because I do think some students do get confused between obedience and conformity. Obedience involves an authority figure, but conformity does not. So obedience generally involves you having to deal with a demand from somebody that is higher in the social hierarchy than you are. So, for example, a teacher or a parent or a boss, for example, these people are generally higher in social hierarchy than you are. Conformity does not involve, conformity is more on your level. Conformity is more about conforming to your friends, to your peers, to even your siblings, for example. So there is a difference, and you do need to know it. This is what we are going to be looking at. I'm moving my stupid face all over the place. This is what we're looking at, and the reason why I've done this slide is just to kind of settle out and separate all the different variants that we are looking at here. So we are looking at dispositional explanations, and what we mean by dispositional, in case you've forgotten, is an explanation that has got something to do with the person, so their personality, their biology, for example. Down here we've got psychological explanations, kind of situational, almost situational explanations maybe. And down here, the students think that these are explanations. They are not. Uniform doesn't explain why we obey. It's just a factor we have to take into account. So let's start with the agentic state, almost bowing down to authority, and a lot of key terminology that you do need to know here. So the agentic state is the first explanation we are going to look at. And it's essentially this idea that people switch into a different state with authority, and they no longer feel responsible for their own actions. And that is called diffusion of responsibility. They diffuse, they move their feeling of responsibility onto the authority figure. Now, immediately you can think of Nazi guards who said that this happened. They said that they essentially diffused their responsibility over to their boss, the concentration camp commander, for example, and they were simply saying, "Well, I was told to do it. I was told to do it. My boss told me to do it. I was only following orders." So they're diffusing responsibility, not taking responsibility for their own actions, and they see themselves as an agent of the authority figure. Hence the name agentic state. So someone tells you to do something and you do it without thinking, and that's the key bit here. You diffuse your responsibility over and you blindly obey without thought. You blindly obey without thought. There is no thinking involved, and you do need to know that. So another key term that does crop up related to this is that you're on obedience autopilot. Obedience autopilot. So agentic state is one state we can be in, and to be honest, it's the one that you kind of do need to know about. As we've said, the individual gives up their free will, and they don't see themselves as acting independently. They're merely an extension of the authority figure's arm, for example, and we surrender our conscience. Now, this is the key thing about agentic state: is you don't generally feel bad about what you do because you're thinking, well, it's not me that's doing it, it's my boss. My boss is basically making me do it. So there is an element of surrendering your conscience and us almost protecting ourselves by blaming our boss. And participants in Milgram's experiment, which is what we're going to come up, did this. They kind of just did what they were told to do because the experimenter was telling them to do so. The other state you need to know about is the autonomous state. Autonomous means independence. It means an ability to think and do things for yourself. And this is where we're aware of the consequences and responsibilities, and we act as an individual person. I've just seen, I don't know why this really irritates me so much. We act as a independent person, and we feel in control when we do this. And here we go. We feel in control about this. We can feel guilt when we do have this, but basically we have independence. So one way to really, what's the best way to describe this? Agentic state is when you give up your conscience. Autonomous state, you can still obey people in the autonomous state if you agree with what the authority figure is asking you to do. So if your boss tells you to go stack a shelf, right, and you agree that, yes, that shelf does need to be stocked, so I'm going to do it, that's not you being in an agentic state, oh, I'm diffusing my responsibility, my boss is making me do this. That's the autonomous state there, because you agree, you're in control. You feel like you can say no, but you agree with the command. If your boss told you to, I don't know, go up to a customer and slap them, and you did slap them, hypothetically, the first thing you do would be to blame your boss, and that's the agentic state. So a consequence of the agentic state is it does make us feel moral strain, also known as cognitive dissonance. It's almost like stress for the brain, right? Stress for your cognitions. Now, the reason why Milgram proposed that we do feel what have you added me for? Milgram proposed that someone in an agentic state will experience moral strain. And the reason is this. An example of moral strain is when you have two conflicting ideas or values. So, for example, you've been brought up to know you must not hurt anybody. You must not hurt anybody. You must not hurt anybody. But you've also been brought up to do that second one. You must always obey authority. You must always obey authority. You must always obey authority. So if me, as your teacher, tells you to hurt someone, you can only do one of those. And we do not like to go against our core values, and that's why we suffer some sort of moral strain when we do it. And this was seen again in Milgram's sample when they got so stressed. So I think there's a beautiful / sadistic quote from Milgram where he boasted that he could break people in like 15-20 minutes. Now, do you need to know this? No. Is this going to be a really good example for later on when we look at the psychodynamic approach? Absolutely it is. One way we cope with moral strain is to basically bury it, right? Is to bury the stress, is to convince ourselves that we had no ability to say no. lied to ourselves. Essentially, this is what these Nazi guards did one of two things: even denied that the Holocaust even took place, despite the fact they were first-hand witnesses, or they just went into denial, mainly about either the Holocaust not existing, or a denial that they really had any choice in the matter, when clearly they did. So these defense mechanisms, which is what these are called, they help us deal with that moral strain. And actually, and this is a very, very important thing, actually probably increase the chance that we will obey again. Because if you did feel really anxious about, obeying an authority, but then we went into denial, well, then we're probably going to feel quite anxious. Sorry, I've just heard Bella trying to get in. So, what's next? These are the key terms. These are the key terms that you do need to know. All right, no, she's fine. These are the key terms that we do need to know. Binding factors is one thing I haven't actually gone through. Binding factors are things that keep us within this agentic state. So almost what I just went through with denial and repression, these are binding factors. They keep us in the agentic state because they make us feel calmer, and therefore much more likely going to copy them again. So in terms of evaluation, again, I'm not going to go through these too much, but I have done these ones where I've kind of tried to say how you would go on. So the problem with agentic state is it fails to explain why people in the same situation as obedient individuals do not obey, right? The problem with this explanation is it doesn't explain individual differences. It doesn't explain individual differences. So the example I've got there, the example of not all students doing their homework. Now, you're all in the same situation. You've all been told by a teacher, an authority figure, to do the work. But yet not all of you go into an agentic state. And this explanation fails to explain why some people don't go into the agentic state. Why is it some people do? Why is it some people don't? Why is it some Nazi? Why is it some Germans? Well, some Germans, most Germans went into the agentic state, arguably, and why did some not? This doesn't explain it. However, it does have research support in the face of Milgram, which we're going to look at later on, but it is an incredibly socially sensitive explanation, and by that I mean it's a potentially offensive explanation because it suggests that humans do not have free will over whether we obey. We all like to think we have free will. We all like to think we have the ability to make our choice, but this explanation is saying that we don't. Whether we obey or not is determined completely beyond our own control, which not many people would like. There is a point here as well with Blass and Schmidt, could not say those two words there, where they demonstrated that their students believed the fault of the obedient individuals in Milgram's research lay with the experimenter, and they suggested that individuals become an agent of the authority figure. So essentially they are supporting agentic state. Let's move on to the second one, right? So agentic state is one explanation you need to know. The second one is the legitimacy of authority. I've been teaching taster days quite recently to year 11s, and I got them to think about, was there a teacher in school that you didn't listen to because you did not think they had the legitimate authority figure? They were not a legitimate authority. They're not qualified enough. They're not educated enough. They don't have the right to tell you what to do. And almost everybody immediately said supply teachers. And then we all discussed supply teachers, which involved locking them in the cupboard, the supply teacher locking them in the cupboard, the supply teacher falling down the stairs because they were chasing students and the students were running away, which they wouldn't normally do with their actual teacher. And it got a bit weird, to be honest with you. But the flip reverse kind of happens as well. Were there teachers that you thought, I will obey you to the end of the earth because you scare the living shit out of me because you are a total legitimate authority figure? And the last thing we also talked about is to what extent, and I want you to think about this, to what extent are your parents or guardians legitimate authority figures to you? Some of you see your parents or guardians as absolute 100% legitimate authority figures. And if they ask you to do something, you will go off and do it. But if you're in your room right now watching this, have a look around. Is your room actually tidy? If it's not tidy, have your parents or guardians told you to tidy it? If you haven't, why not? Because you might not see them as a legitimate authority figure, which a lot of students don't actually, which is quite bad, I think. So this explanation essentially says that we perceive, that word is crucial here, crucial. So it's subjective, it's opinionated, it's not a fact. We have to, like some people will perceive me, some of you perceive me to have authority, others don't perceive me. It's subjective. This actually does involve individual differences here. So we subjectively perceive the authority figure to have the power to tell us what to do, maybe because they're more qualified, maybe because they're educated, maybe because of experience, maybe because of age, maybe because they've got a purple lanyard on, for example. There's a lot here. So there's loads of factors that come into this, right? And there's loads of little teeny tiny bits to this theory. So one thing you want to think about is what do they look like? If I come in a tank top, that's a horrible thought actually, but if I come in a tank top, you may not take me seriously. You may not deem me to have a legitimate authority figure, and you would be right there. But if I came in, not in a tuxedo, but if I came in a three-piece suit, looking sharp, tailored, maybe you would, for example, or some other authoritative wear. How do they behave? Do they have confidence? A couple of years ago, I was in Porto Airport, and our flight got cancelled or delayed. I can't really remember, and they sent this. I think she was quite an old lady, but she sent this little old lady out who had the confidence of a I don't know, to be honest, someone who's not very confident, and she basically got stampeded past. She was like, the flight has been well, and we were like, not talking to you, right? Not talking to you. She was wearing a high vis. She's wearing uniform, a flyby uniform, I think. And we were like, no, I'm not dealing with you, right? Because you have no idea what you're on about. Imagine if a teacher was stood in front of the class and they were not confident at all. If that happened in secondary school, that's what usually made teachers cry, because the students would smell blood, basically. Are they confident? Are they in charge? And are they wearing any symbols of authority? Are they wearing uniform? Are they wearing an ID badge, for example? And these are three things. Now, here's the thing that irritates me about this theory. Some people think that's just the theory, and they just list these off. This theory does go quite a lot deeper. So it involves a subjective perception, which is what I was saying a minute ago. Whether or not it's whether somebody thinks that the authority has authority. It's not a fact. So that explains the individual differences. Why do some of you obey when I ask you to do homework and some of you don't? Because some of you see me as a legitimate authority figure and some of you don't, which is quite offensive. Individuals base this perception about where they are in the social hierarchy. Crucial term. So we are all in a social hierarchy. As students, you probably are quite low down in the social hierarchy. People mock students quite a lot. Teenagers are generally quite low in the social hierarchy. And again, this is a sweeping, broad generalization, but generally society does look down on teenagers, and they always have done, by the way. This is not anything against you. It's, if in 50 years' time, you'll be looking down on teenagers, thinking that they're weird, horrible people. So teenagers have to actually obey quite a lot because they're quite low down in the social hierarchy. They're not bosses. They're not authority. They're not managers. They're not chief executives. Students and teenagers are the ones obeying. And there's another term here. Students generally recognize they are lower in the social hierarchy than teachers. I've just said that. As a result, they typically tend to obey because they recognize that teachers have got a right to make a demand. Everyone in the psychology team has teaching qualifications. They have teaching experience. They have life experience. So a lot of students will recognize that makes them a legitimate authority figure. The other side to this is students are actually quite socialized to recognize legitimate authority. Now, this is blowing us in the wind. The wind is blowing us quite close to sociological waters here, which I feel deeply uncomfortable about, and I don't like sociology. But yeah, just look at the slide. I can't deal with it. It's such rubbish, honestly. I can't help it. I can't help it. Talk about social hierarchy, sociology, because they're lower. It doesn't matter. So again, I'm not going to go into this too much because this will be in the later slides with Milgram. But this is good evidence for the legitimacy of authority. That as soon as Milgram stripped away some of the legitimate authority factors like uniform or location, people did disobey a bit more. So when the study went to a run-down office block instead of a prestigious university, so location's important. Let me give an example. Let me tell you a brief story, I guess, about a date I had a couple of years ago. We stopped off in Five Guys in Whiteley. We're going to the cinema. The worst date ever, by the way. The worst date venue ever. But we stopped off at Five Guys, and one of my students walked in at the time. My students at the time, and we had five mates, and he was a lovely lad, big, tall rugby player, quiet as a mouse in the class, quiet as a mouse, did not say anything at all. I stopped the date I pressed the pause button on the date, walked over to Ben, and I said hello, and then started jokingly having a go at him in front of his mates. Now, in terms of location, I have no legitimate power in Five Guys Whiteley. I have no power there. I have no legitimacy of authority. So when I started kicking off to Ben turned round, and I won't tell you the full thing of what he said, but he basically told me to F off. He did it in a joking way. He did it in like I know you're just trying to piss me off, basically. But he told me to F off. And it got me thinking, imagine if in the class, on my turf, in my classroom, I turn around to Ben and said, Ben, you haven't done your homework or something. And then he turns around to tell me to F off. I would lose my shit. I would just see red descend. But I laughed in Five Guys because I recognised I didn't have any legitimate authority there, and Ben laughed as well. So it was a very funny experience for all, apart from Gemma, who was annoyed that I stopped the date and went off to go speak to someone. But she's dead to me, so whatever. Anyway, feel free to pause the video here. Hoffling is a good piece of research to use here. Hoffling is a very good piece of research to use. So I would recommend you know Milgram, but I would also recommend you know Hoffling, and I'd also recommend that you know Bickman as well. Now, I'm not going to go through these pieces of research because I literally would be just reading off the screen, which is pretty much what I do anyway. But if you want to pause for Hoffling, pause the screen now. And again, because Hoffling isn't named in the spec, by the way, you only really need to know what they found, not necessarily the whole procedure, but maybe one or two lines about what they found, and enough for you to know what the study is about. And Bickman as well, 153 participants who were not aware, so it was a covert social experiment. You wanted to see if uniform was a factor. And again, I'm not going to read this because I'm going to allow you to read this, so feel free to pause it. And you've also got another slide here as well with what Bickman found. So for this piece of research is backed up by Milgram, Hoffling, and Bickman, and you kind of need to know them all. You do kind of need to know them. Maybe not to the degree to which I've written them in the slides, but certainly to a good level. And obviously you're going to need to know the results, and here are the results. As you can see, and hopefully you have read that, my eyebrows coming out a bit too much. Clearly, if they wear a more authoritative uniform, the picking up a bag scenario, uniform matters here. Uniform matters. People see uniform as a legitimate authority figure. So it has massive practical implications. It does also have face validity, which obviously makes sense. It makes logical sense that we obey people with a greater air of authority. High-vis jackets, so on and so forth. So face validity is always fine. It does take into account cultural differences. So high-vis jackets are not seen as authority all around the world. So this does actually explain why there may be cultural and individual differences because certain cultures may not see height as authoritative. Certain cultures may not see a deep, booming voice as authoritative, for example, and therefore that explains why some people don't obey. And then finally, you got research support from a whole host of people. And then finally, you got model Peel here. Quite a good point, this, by the way, if I say so myself. Quite a good point. Make sure you pause it, make a note of this. But the authoritarian personality is also another one. So last explanation here. Don't know how long I've been going for, but I feel like I've been going on for a couple of hours. Authoritarian personality, first thing to know, it's a dispositional explanation. Dispositional explanation, right? So this is something to do with the person. It's nothing to do with the situation or the psychology. This is to do with the person. Why did that individual person disobey? A couple of years ago, I had a student who was a lovely lad, who basically his dad was high up in the army, and his dad was very regimented, extremely strict, extremely strict. And my student, who I shall call Peter, um, Peter in this case, was incredibly, unbelievably respectful of authority because he had been trained and honed that way. Anyone who he deemed to be above him, like a teacher wearing a purple lanyard, he would respect, he would try to please, and to the point where it was really bad. Anyone who he considered to be below him, he would not give them the time of day, that they are not worth his opinion, so on and so forth. So Peter, in this case, whenever he would get a C, which it was a good grade for him, by the way, was a good grade, he would come up to me on the verge of tears at the end, and he'd be like, Kieran, I really want to do you proud. And I'll be there like, Dan, no, you're fine, mate. You're fine. Like, no. I want to make you proud. I'm gonna go away. I'm gonna go away. I'm gonna make you really proud of me because I'm not doing good enough. And I'll be like, oh, I've just said his name then. Actually, I think I forgot to say Peter. Shit. I'd say Peter. You're making me really uncomfortable at this stage. We'll just move on because I'll give him the guy away. So authoritarian personality, something to do with the personality. But why? It's more likely going to obey than others because they have a more obedient personality. And the reason why this is because they have a great deal respect for order and hierarchy, for example, is because of strict parents. So if you have a strict parenting, if you have strict parenting, as in your parents are very strict, they're harsh with their upbringing. They give you little love, and the punishment doesn't fit the crime, as in the punishment's always way bigger than the crime. You're going to go one of two ways. So you're either going to fear your parents, and that's going to lead you to be excessively respectful of your authority figures like Peter. Or you're going to go down the route where you hate your parents, and actually that leads to you displacing that onto others who typically are below you. So one thing you probably do need to know here, and I don't want to go through a whole explanation about this, is this leads to generally what's called right-wing thinking, where people who are right-wing, and I don't want to get into the politics of it, but people who are right-wing or conservative, they want to conserve the traditional hierarchy in society. And they believe that some people are better, thus they deserve more rights than others, for example. So extreme cases are like men are better than women, or racism or ageism, for example. Now, I'm not going to go into politics or give away politics, etc., or give away my politics. But how do I do this without saying how crap an idea that is? Oh God, I've just set myself up here. But yeah, that's what I was saying. People who are right wing generally believe that there is a hierarchy to society, and there are people who are above them that they should absolutely bow down to, and there are people below them who they are below them for a reason, kind of thing. So if you have an authoritarian personality, it could be argued that you are quite right wing or quite conservative in your political viewpoints. And one way to measure this would be to give someone what's called the F scale. Now, this is one of the most, in my opinion, flawed scales in psychology. The F scale stands for, well, could stand for from scale, or more likely the fascism scale. It measures your fascism. It measures your right wingism, basically. And from that, you can measure how much someone has an authoritarian personality. I would recommend you take this test. I would recommend you see if you are left, center, or right wing. If you are right wing, and I believe, I can't remember if it's whether you score high or low in the test. But essentially, Elms and Milgram found that actually a lot of the people that did obey in Milgram's study were actually quite right wing, apparently. Right, apparently. Now, there is a lot more to this. There is a lot more to it. So I'm going to go away and do a bit more research on this and add to the slides to make sure you do look at the slides. However, authoritarian personality does actually explain individual differences very, very well. It explains in Milgram why some people obeyed to 450 volts and why some people didn't obey, because they had different personalities. However, it is only, and this is a very good point, by the way, it is only a correlation. It's only a relationship between strict parenting and obedience. No one has actually ever really done A causes B. No one's ever really done that. It's just a correlation. And then how it is measured, and again, this is a really, really good point. How we measure the authoritarian personality is actually subject to a lot of bias. That questionnaire I just showed you, the F scale, is not the best scale going. It's a lot of, for example, a lot of the questions can be interpreted in multiple ways. So how do you know you are measuring fascism or right-wingism or conservatism? How do you know you're measuring that if the question can be interpreted in several ways? That's like saying to me, I'm going to measure mood, and then me going, are you happy? That's not a good way of measuring. So, a couple of evaluations here, and then you've got authoritarian personality peel. This is going to be for the next slide where I look through Milgram. I think that was a very, very long slide, a very, very long video. Hope it was useful though. Just a word of advice. This bullet point is a heifer, basically. There's a lot to it. So if you are going to revise this, you need to make sure you're revising all three theories and all three evaluations and being able to link them to research and more specifically Milgram. Peace out.